The stars had always been silent. For 300 years, humanity had spread across 17 star systems, building colonies on distant worlds and mining asteroids for precious metals. They had searched for signs of intelligent life with powerful telescopes and sensitive receivers. They had sent probes into the darkness between stars. They had hoped and wondered and dreamed. But the universe remained quiet, and humans began to believe they were alone. Captain Daniel stood on the bridge of his ship, the Starward Pioneer, watching the endless black through the main viewport. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes from years of squinting at navigation charts. He had spent 20 years exploring the edges of known space, mapping new systems and cataloging planets that might one day become homes for millions of people. It was good work, important work, but part of him had always wanted something more. He wanted to find proof that humanity was not the only thinking species in the cosmos. The Starward Pioneer was 3 weeks into a routine survey mission near the outer boundary of explored space. They were studying a red dwarf star with 4 rocky planets, none of them suitable for colonization, but all of them interesting to the scientists aboard. It was the kind of mission that filled databases with useful information but rarely produced exciting discoveries. Then Lieutenant Laura called out from her station. She was young, barely 30, with sharp eyes and a talent for finding patterns in noise. She had been monitoring communications frequencies out of habit, not expecting to hear anything except the usual cosmic static. But something was different today. There was a signal coming from a small moon orbiting the third planet. It was regular and repeating, clearly artificial, not random noise from a pulsar or the echo of some natural phenomenon. This was something made by someone. Daniel felt his heart begin to pound. He walked to Laura's station and looked at her screens, seeing the waveform repeat over and over. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a beacon calling out to anyone who might be listening. Protocol was clear in situations like this. He was supposed to log the discovery, send a message to Earth Command, and wait for instructions. Contact with potential alien intelligence was too important to handle without guidance from the highest levels of government. But Earth was 4 months away by fastest communication, and the signal was right there, waiting. Daniel made his decision. They would investigate. Chief Science Officer Cole protested mildly, reminding Daniel of the regulations. Was a careful man who believed in following procedures, but even he could not hide his excitement at the prospect of genuine first contact. He prepared his team to analyze whatever they might find. The Starward Pioneer changed course and began its approach to the small moon. As they drew closer, their sensors detected structures on the surface. Buildings of some kind, arranged in geometric patterns that spoke of intelligence and purpose. But there were no energy signatures, no signs of activity. Whatever civilization had built this outpost had left it behind long ago. They landed near the largest structure, a dome of pale metal that gleamed in the light of the distant red sun. Daniel led the away team himself, wearing an environmental suit and carrying a sidearm he hoped he would never need to use, walked beside him, already recording everything with the cameras built into his helmet. Inside the dome, they found wonders. The walls were covered with symbols that might have been writing or might have been art. Machines of unknown purpose stood silent in rows, their designs unlike anything human engineers had ever imagined. And in the center of the chamber, they found the beacon, a crystalline column that pulsed with gentle light. Ensign Brandon was the youngest member of the team, eager and curious and perhaps a little careless. While the others examined the walls and took samples, he approached the beacon. He reached out and touched its surface, wanting to feel the texture of alien technology beneath his gloved fingers. The column flared bright, and a sound filled the dome, a tone that seemed to resonate in their bones. Then everything went dark again and the beacon fell silent. Instruments detected a massive energy pulse leaving the moon, traveling outward at speeds their physics said should be impossible. It was heading into deep space, toward a region no human ship had ever explored. Brandon apologized frantically, not understanding what he had done. None of them did. Daniel ordered everyone back to the ship. Something felt wrong now, the excitement of discovery replaced by a cold weight in his stomach. He pushed the starward Pioneer to maximum speed, putting distance between them and the moon while Laura tried to track the energy pulse. 2 hours later, a ship appeared. It came out of nowhere, dropping into normal space close enough that the starward Pioneer's proximity alarm screamed. It was huge, easily 10 times the size of Daniel's vessel, and its design was nothing like the elegant structures on the moon. This ship was brutal and organic, covered in what looked like chitin and sharp protrusions. It did not respond to hails. It did not slow down. It simply turned toward them and attacked. The first blast tore through the Pioneer's shields and carved a hole in the engineering section. 16 crew members died in that instant, pulled into the vacuum before emergency bulkheads could seal. Daniel shouted orders, trying to return fire while Laura called for emergency jump calculations. Their weapons did nothing. Beams that should have melted steel simply scattered across the alien hull. More blasts came, each one killing more of his people. Daniel watched helplessly as the ship he had commanded for 8 years was torn apart around him. He saw the alien vessel open, saw smaller craft pour out like wasps from a hive. He saw creatures through the viewports, massive things with too many limbs and eyes that glowed with cold hunger. Laura finished her calculations. Daniel ordered the jump, and the starward Pioneer fled, leaving behind debris and bodies and any hope that this had all been a misunderstanding. The alien ship did not pursue. Perhaps it did not need to. It had learned everything it needed to know about these new creatures called humans. The journey back to Earth took 6 weeks. Daniel spent most of that time sitting alone in his quarters, replaying the battle in his mind. He had made the decision to investigate. He had led his people into that dome. He had brought them to the attention of something terrible. Of the 92 people who had left Earth on the starward Pioneer, only 41 returned. They carried with them sensor data and recordings, and the knowledge that humanity was no longer alone. The universe was not empty after all. It was inhabited by monsters. And those monsters now knew where to find Earth. The council chamber in Geneva was silent as Daniel finished his report. Admirals and politicians and scientists sat in rows of curved seats, their faces pale in the blue glow of holographic displays. They had watched the footage from the starward Pioneer, seen the alien ship emerge from nothing, witnessed the slaughter of 51 human beings in less than 3 minutes. Now they waited for someone to tell them what to do. Admiral Young was the first to speak. She was a small woman with white hair and a voice that carried authority. She had commanded fleets and won battles and never once shown fear to her subordinates. But Daniel could see it in her eyes now, the same cold dread that had lived in his chest since that day near the red dwarf star. She asked questions. How fast was the alien ship? What weapons did it use? Could their attacks be predicted or blocked? Daniel answered as best he could, but most of his answers were the same. He did not know. They had been caught completely unprepared, like children attacked by wolves. Intelligence officer Christopher Lane had been working without sleep since the Pioneer returned. He was a thin man with dark circles under his eyes and a mind that never stopped connecting pieces of information. He had searched through every database humanity possessed, looking for anything that might explain what they had encountered, and he had found something that made everything worse. Centuries ago, human archaeologists had discovered ruins on several distant worlds, dead cities and empty structures that spoke of civilizations that had risen and fallen before Earth even formed. The scientists had cataloged these discoveries and filed them away, assuming the builders had simply gone extinct through natural causes. But Christopher had found patterns in the ruins, damage patterns that matched the weapons used against the Pioneer. The aliens had a name, Other species had called them the before those species were exterminated, and according to the fragmentary records Christopher had pieced together, they had been doing this for a very long time. At least 47 spacefaring civilizations had been destroyed by them over the past million years. No species had ever survived first contact. No species had ever fought back and won. The council erupted into chaos. Politicians demanded immediate peace negotiations. Military officers called for massive fleet mobilization. Scientists argued about the feasibility of building new weapons. Everyone shouted over everyone else, and nothing was accomplished. Let them yell for several minutes before she raised her hand. Silence fell again, sudden and complete. She said that peace was not an option. They did not negotiate because they had no reason to negotiate. They were not conquerors who wanted territory or resources that could be bargained for. They were consumers. They ate other species, not just their bodies but their knowledge and their technology and everything they had ever built. Humanity had nothing to offer them except meat. 3 months passed. Humanity prepared as best it could, building new ships and training new soldiers and fortifying colony worlds. People tried to continue their normal lives, going to work and raising children and pretending that everything would be fine. Some believed they would never find Earth, that the galaxy was too large and humanity too small to be worth hunting. Those people were wrong. The colony world of New Haven was home to 6 million people. It had been one of the first worlds settled beyond Earth, a green planet with blue oceans and cities that sparkled in the sunlight. Commander Stephen Grant led a fleet of 12 warships on a routine patrol near New Haven when they lost contact with the surface. Every communication channel went dead at the same moment. Every satellite went dark. Stephen pushed his fleet to maximum speed, arriving at New Haven in less than 4 hours. What they found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cities were gone, not destroyed, but simply empty. Buildings stood intact with doors left open and meals still on tables. Vehicles sat in streets with their engines running. But there were no bodies, no blood, no signs of battle. 6 million people had vanished without a trace. Then they found the ships. Vessels hung in orbit, so many that they blocked out the stars. They were already leaving when Stephen arrived, their holds filled with humanity's children. He ordered his fleet to attack, knowing it was hopeless, knowing he was sending his people to die. They killed 3 ships before the rest of the fleet was destroyed. Stephen was found drifting in an escape pod 2 days later, the only survivor. Panic spread across human space. Colonies demanded protection that the military could not provide. Ships were not enough. Weapons were not enough. They learned from every battle, their hive minds sharing information instantly across their entire species. Every tactic used against them only worked once. Every weapon became useless after its first deployment. Doctor was a who had spent her career studying theoretical alien life. She had dreamed of meeting another intelligent species someday, of learning how they thought and what they believed. Now her dreams had become nightmares, and she spent her days trying to find a weakness in an enemy that seemed to have none. She studied the reports from New Haven and the recordings from the Pioneer. She analyzed the fragments of technology that human ships had recovered, and slowly, a theory began to form in her mind. They were a hive mind. Every individual was connected to every other individual through some kind of biological network that humans did not fully understand. This made them terrifyingly coordinated, able to adapt to any situation in seconds. But it might also be their weakness. Every species that had ever destroyed had been logical. They had operated on consensus and calculated strategies, making decisions through processes that could be predicted and countered. But humans were different. Humans were messy and irrational and capable of doing things that made no sense at all. Human history was filled with moments when individuals had made insane choices that somehow worked. Soldiers who charged impossible odds and won. Scientists who pursued ridiculous ideas and changed the world. Artists who broke every rule and created beauty. Presented her theory to Admiral Young. Humanity could not outfight the They could not outthink them, but they might be able to confuse them. A decentralized resistance, thousands of small cells operating independently with no central command, might create enough chaos to overwhelm the hive mind. Listened carefully. Then she gave the orders that would reshape human military doctrine forever. There would be no more grand fleets or coordinated campaigns. Instead, humanity would become unpredictable. They would fight like no species had ever fought before. It was a desperate plan born from desperation, but it was the only plan they had. The resistance began as whispers in the dark. On occupied worlds and in the shadows of space, small groups of humans started fighting back. They had no uniforms and no ranks and no central command to give them orders. They had only their anger and their fear and their stubborn refusal to be consumed. Captain Tors had been stationed on 7 when they came. She watched the orbital defense platforms fall in minutes, watched the invasion ships descend on cities like locusts on grain. She should have died with the rest of her unit, but she was away from base when the attack began, visiting her brother in the countryside. By the time she returned, there was nothing left to defend. She gathered survivors in the hills and forests, teaching them to fight an enemy that could not be beaten through conventional means. They learned to strike fast and vanish faster, to use the terrain against creatures who had never hunted prey in heavy gravity. They learned to communicate without radios, using signals and codes that they could not intercept. They learned to be ghosts. Reeves was an engineer who had worked in the colony's power plants. Now he built weapons from scrap metal and salvage technology. He created devices that scrambled communications for precious seconds, explosives that could pierce their chitin armor, traps that used the aliens' own biology against them. Every night he worked until his hands bled, knowing that each weapon might save human lives. Harper had been a doctor before the invasion. Now she was a medic in a war without hospitals. She treated wounds with supplies stolen from abandoned pharmacies and performed surgeries in caves lit by flickering lanterns. She had learned more about physiology than any scientist on Earth, cutting open dead drones to understand how they worked. Her knowledge of their neurotoxins had saved dozens of fighters who would otherwise have died in agony. Let her sell against a patrol, killing 4 drones before the rest could respond. They captured weapons and supplies and retreated into the mountains before reinforcements arrived. It was a small victory, meaningless in the larger war, but it proved that they could bleed. It proved that humans could fight. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on 100 worlds. Resistance cells attacked supply lines and ambushed scout ships. They used different tactics every time, never repeating strategies that the hive mind could learn from. Some cells fought with stolen technology while others used nothing but homemade weapons. Some operated in cities while others hid in wilderness. The chaos was deliberate, designed to overwhelm them with information they could not process. Daniel could not simply wait while others fought. The guilt of his initial decision ate at him like acid, keeping him awake at night and haunting his days. He had brought this upon humanity. He had touched the sleeping dragon and woken it to hunger. He needed to do something that might make a difference. He volunteered for a mission that everyone knew was likely suicide. Admiral Young needed intelligence about their numbers, their defenses, anything that might reveal a weakness. Daniel would lead a small team into the heart of enemy territory and try to return with answers. The odds of survival were almost zero. His crew was made of volunteers who understood the risks. Pilot Cooper was the best pilot in the fleet, a man who could fly through impossible spaces and always find a way out. Communications specialist Santos could monitor signals and translate fragments of their strange language. Combat specialist Moore had killed more than anyone still alive. They were good people, brave people, and Daniel tried not to think about how many of them would die because of his need for redemption. The mission began well. They slipped past patrols using a captured alien stealth device that had learned to operate. They traveled deeper into enemy space than any human had ever gone, passing worlds that had been stripped bare and others that pulsed with alien life. The scale of territory was terrifying. They had been spreading across the galaxy for millions of years, and their numbers were beyond counting. Then they were captured. The ship came from nowhere, appearing beside them before could react. Their stealth device had failed, or perhaps it had never really worked at all. Perhaps they had been watching them the entire time, curious about these strange creatures who dared enter their domain. Within minutes, Daniel and his crew were prisoners. They were taken to a processing station, a massive structure orbiting a dead world. Daniel learned what happened to captured species. They did not simply kill their prey. They studied them first, extracting every piece of useful knowledge before consuming their bodies. Humans were held in transparent cells, forced to watch as others were taken away and never returned. Daniel spent weeks in that prison, watching and listening and learning. He saw how they communicated, patterns of light and sound that rippled through their hive mind. He saw how they processed information, routing everything through central nodes that distributed commands to the drones. And he saw the Queen. She was massive, larger than a building, suspended in the center of the station like a spider in its web. Thousands of connections linked her to the hive mind, channeling information from across space. She was the heart of their collective consciousness, the central processor that made sense of everything her species experienced. Without her, the hive would fall into confusion. But there was something else. Daniel observed how the Queen sometimes paused, how her responses slowed when too much information arrived at once. The hive mind was powerful, but it had limits. If enough conflicting signals flooded the network simultaneously, the Queen might be overwhelmed. The connection might be disrupted. He had found their weakness. Cooper died making Daniel's escape possible. He attacked the guards with his bare hands, buying precious seconds while the others fled. Daniel wanted to go back for him but pulled him away, telling him that sacrifice could not be wasted. They stole a small ship and ran, evading pursuit through asteroid fields and nebulae until they finally reached human space. Daniel carried some memory with him, along with the knowledge that might save humanity. He brought his intelligence to Admiral Young and told her what he had learned. The Queen could be beaten. The hive mind could be broken. They just needed a way to do it. Began working on a weapon that same day. The weapon took 6 months to build, and her team worked without rest, turning Daniel's observations into something that might actually work. They called it the Neural Disruptor, a device designed to flood the hive mind with contradictory signals. If it functioned as intended, it would create a storm of confusion that not even the Queen could process. The connection between the drones and their collective consciousness would shatter like glass. The problem was delivery. The disruptor had to be activated within range of the Queen herself, at the very heart of territory. That meant someone would have to carry it there, fight through whatever defenses protected her, and trigger the device knowing they would never escape. It was not just a suicide mission. It was a guarantee of death. Admiral Young called for volunteers anyway. She expected a handful of people to step forward, individuals with nothing left to lose or causes they cared about more than their own lives. Instead, she received over 10,000 applications in the first hour. Soldiers and civilians, young and old, people from every colony in human space wanted to be part of the mission. Humanity had decided to fight. The fleet that assembled at the rendezvous point was the largest in human history. 3,000 warships from every world, crewed by people who understood what they were facing. Most of them would not survive. Many would die in the first minutes of battle, but they came anyway because the alternative was extinction. Commander Vance led the main assault force. She was a veteran of a dozen campaigns, a woman who had lost her husband to the at New Haven and channeled her grief into cold determination. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Shaw, coordinated with the resistance cells scattered across occupied space. When the fleet attacked, the cells would strike simultaneously, creating chaos throughout territory. Tors received her orders on 7. Her resistance cell had been surviving for over a year now, growing from a handful of survivors to a force of nearly 200 fighters. They had killed hundreds of and freed thousands of captives. Now they had their most important mission yet. A processing ship orbited their world, one of the stations where captured humans were studied before consumption. His team would infiltrate that ship and disable its communications array. Without real-time data from the processing station, the Queen would have one less source of information during the battle. Every blind spot helped, and volunteered immediately. They had been with since the beginning, through victories and losses and the deaths of friends. They would be with her at the end. Daniel insisted on joining the strike team that would carry the disruptor. Admiral Young tried to refuse him, saying he had already done enough, that his intelligence had made the mission possible. But Daniel would not be. He had started this war with a single decision. He needed to be there when it ended. Would come too. The disruptor was her creation, and only she fully understood its mechanisms. Someone would need to activate it manually, adjusting frequencies in real time as the Queen tried to resist. That someone would have to stay behind while the device did its work. Accepted this without hesitation. The fleet launched on a cold morning in January. 3,000 ships entered hyperspace, carrying 2 million humans toward the battle that would determine the fate of their species. Some prayed to gods they had never believed in before. Others wrote letters to loved ones who might never receive them. Many simply sat in silence, thinking about everything they were leaving behind. They emerged from hyperspace at the edge of territory and began their advance. The aliens responded immediately, thousands of ships rising to meet them. The battle began with fire and thunder, beams of energy crossing the void between fleets. Human ships died by the dozens in the first minute, then by the hundreds. Shaw coordinated the chaos. He sent orders to resistance cells across a dozen systems, telling them to strike now with everything they had. On 7, led her team against the processing station. On a moon in the Antares system, a group of former miners collapsed tunnels on a breeding ground. On a station in deep space, a single engineer overloaded a reactor and took 500 drones with him. The hive mind stuttered. The Queen received conflicting information from 100 sources, each one demanding her attention. For the first time in her endless existence, she could not process everything. Her responses slowed. Her drones hesitated. The human fleet pressed forward. They took terrible losses, ships crumpling under fire like paper in a flame. But they kept coming, pushing deeper into enemy territory with every passing minute. Commander Vance led from the front, her own ship and burning but still fighting. She would not retreat. None of them would. His team breached the processing station and fought their way to the communications array. The corridors were narrow and dark, filled with drones that had been designed for exactly this kind of close combat. Fell in the third corridor, a blade piercing his chest. Tried to save him, but there was nothing she could do. She closed his eyes and kept moving. They reached the array, held off the drones while planted explosives on the primary transmitters. The blast killed everything in the room, including 6 of fighters, but the array was destroyed. The processing station went dark and the Queen lost another piece of her vision. The strike team's ship punched through the defensive line. Daniel watched through the viewport as they approached the alien, a planet covered entirely in organic structures that pulsed with sickly light. This was where the Queen lived. This was where it would end. They landed hard, the ship crashing into a field of something that might have been grass if grass could scream. Daniel led the way toward the central spire, the structure that housed the Queen, followed with the disruptor strapped to her back, and 4 other fighters covered their flanks. They fought through corridors that seemed to shift and change, walls that reached for them and floors that tried to swallow their feet. They lost to a trap that sprayed acid from hidden vents. They lost 2 others to drones that appeared from nowhere. But they kept moving, climbing higher and higher toward the chamber at the top. The Queen waited for them there. The Queen was vast beyond comprehension. She filled the chamber like a mountain fills a valley, her body a mass of chitin and pulsing organs connected to thousands of cables that stretched into the walls. Eyes covered every surface of her form, each one tracking the tiny humans who had dared enter her domain. She had consumed 1,000,000 species across 1,000,000 years. She had never been challenged in her own throne room. Daniel stood at the edge of the chamber, looking up at the creature that had destroyed so many worlds. He felt small and fragile and utterly mortal. His weapon seemed like a toy against something so ancient and powerful, but he had not come this far to surrender. The Queen spoke. Her voice came from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the air itself. But the words came from captured humans, prisoners who had been integrated into her network and now served as her translators. Their faces were slack, their eyes empty, but their mouths moved with her thoughts. She said she had been watching humanity since the beacon was triggered. She had studied their ships and their weapons and their minds. She had found them interesting, more chaotic than other species, harder to predict. But they were still weak. They were still meat. They would be consumed like all the others. Daniel stepped forward and spoke. He said that humanity would not surrender. They would not beg for mercy or negotiate for peace. They had come to fight, and they would keep fighting until they won or until every last human was dead. They had never faced a species willing to burn everything rather than submit. They were facing one now. The Queen laughed. It was a terrible sound that resonated through the hive mind, felt by every drone across the galaxy. She had heard such words before, from countless species who believed themselves special. They had all died screaming. She offered Daniel a choice. Surrender humanity peacefully, and she would make the consumption painless. Resist, and they would hunt humans to extinction across every corner of the galaxy. They would suffer for centuries before the last of them finally died. There would be no mercy. Daniel thought of everyone who had brought him to this moment. He thought of his crew on the Starward Pioneer, the ones who had died because of his decision to investigate that alien signal. He thought of Cooper, who had sacrificed himself so that Daniel could escape and bring back the intelligence they needed. He thought of the millions who had fallen on New Haven and Seven and 100 other worlds. He thought of the children who would never grow up and the families who would never be reunited. He said no. Activated the neural disruptor. The device hummed to life, projecting waves of contradictory signals into the hive mind. The Queen screamed, a sound that shattered the translators and cracked the walls. Across the galaxy, drones faltered, their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. The connection that had united them was tearing apart. But the Queen fought back. She was ancient and powerful, and she had reserves of strength that no human could match. She began filtering the signals, adapting to the disruption, adjusted the frequencies, but she could not keep up. The Queen was learning too fast. Daniel understood what had to happen. The disruptor needed a constant signal to maintain the disruption, and that signal had to be modulated in real time. Someone had to stay with the device and keep adjusting it until the Queen's mind shattered completely. Someone had to die here. He told to run. She refused. This was her creation, her responsibility. She had built the weapon knowing she would have to stay behind. She had made her peace with death months ago. Daniel said he was the one who had started everything. His decision at that alien outpost had brought humanity to war. His decision now would end it. This was his burden to carry, his debt to pay. He would not let anyone else die for his mistakes. Looked at him for a long moment. Then she showed him how to operate the disruptor, explaining which frequencies to adjust and when. She pressed the controls into his hands and told him he was a good man. She told him that humanity would remember. Then she ran. Daniel sealed the chamber door behind her and turned back to the Queen. She was thrashing now, her massive body convulsing as the contradictory signals tore through her mind. Drones collapsed around him, their connection to the hive severed. The cables that linked her to the network sparked and burned. He adjusted the frequencies again and again, watching her weaken with each pulse. She tried to reach him with her remaining drones, but he fought them off with his sidearm and his bare hands. He would not let them stop him. He would not fail. Outside reached the strike team's damaged ship. Was already there, holding off drones with a weapon in each hand. They launched as the spire began to collapse, flames erupting from every surface. They broke atmosphere and climbed toward the stars, toward the human fleet that was still fighting above. The Queen died screaming. Her mind shattered into a billion fragments, each one carrying confusion and pain to every in existence. Across the galaxy, drones fell where they stood. Ships drifted without guidance. The hive that had terrorized the cosmos for 1,000,000 years dissolved in an instant of absolute chaos. Daniel felt the floor give way beneath him. He was falling, burning, dying, but he was smiling. He had made a decision that changed everything. He had made another decision that saved everyone. The human fleet watched as the armada went dark. Ships that had been attacking moments before now drifted aimlessly, their crews dead or mindless. Commander Vance ordered a ceasefire and stared at the screens in disbelief. They had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that had never been defeated, humanity had won. On 7, Tors watched the last drones fall, stood beside her, wounded but alive. They held each other and wept, not knowing whether their tears were for joy or grief or both. Admiral Young received the news on her flagship. She sat down heavily in her command chair and let herself feel something she had not felt in years. Hope. Humanity had a future again. Years passed. The colonies were rebuilt, the dead were honored, the survivors carried on. A memorial was constructed on Earth, a wall of black stone that stretched for miles, bearing the names of everyone who had fallen in the war. Millions of names, carved deep so they would never fade. Became the head of the Institute. She gave lectures about thee and the war, teaching future generations about the threat that had almost ended everything. She always concluded with the same story, about a captain named Daniel who made one decision that changed everything and another decision that saved everyone. Tors was appointed military governor of the recovered colonies. She oversaw the rebuilding of worlds that had been devastated, the construction of new cities on ground that had been watered with human blood. She kept a photograph on her desk showing her original resistance cell, faces of friends who had fought and died beside her. And in the rebuilt city of New Haven, a little girl named Sophie asked her father about the memorial they were visiting. She wanted to know what all the names meant, who these people were. Her father knelt beside her and told her about the war. He told her about the aliens who had come to consume humanity and the humans who had refused to be consumed. He told her about the soldiers and scientists and ordinary people who had given everything so that children like Sophie could live in peace. Sophie asked if they were scared. Her father smiled gently. He said yes, they were terrified, every single one of them. But they fought anyway because that is what humans do. When everything seems hopeless, when the enemy seems unstoppable, when the universe itself appears to demand surrender, humans choose to fight. They choose to hope. They choose to believe that a single decision can change everything. Sophie looked at the names carved into the stone. Thousands and thousands of names, each one a person who had lived and loved and given their life for the future. She reached out and touched one of them, feeling the letters beneath her small fingers. Then she turned to her father and said that, when she grew up, she wanted to be brave like them. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. He told her that she already was. Above them, the stars shone bright and clear. The universe was vast and full of mysteries, some wondrous and some terrible. But humanity would face whatever came next together. They had proven themselves in the fires of war. They had earned their place among the stars. And somewhere in the infinite darkness, other species whispered about the humans. They told stories of the creatures who had done the impossible, who had defeated the Devourers and freed the galaxy from 1,000,000 years of fear. They spoke the name with something that might have been awe. Humanity, the species that refused to die.